For years, Kaelen Valerius had been the stone-cold alpha king who ruled the Northern Territories with an iron fist, the terrifying man who had cast Clara Sterling aside without a single second thought. He was a sovereign built entirely of winter storms and unbreakable royal pride, a beast who commanded legions and bowed to absolutely no one. But destiny has a remarkably cruel way of balancing the scales of a severed bond. He was about to learn that true, undeniable power did not lie in the ruthless execution of authority, and the brutal king who never begged would soon drop to his bare knees in the freezing mud. The border village of Brindlewood smelled of damp pine needles, wet granite, and the sharp, metallic tang of melting iron. Nestled deep within the treacherous, misty valleys that formed the political divide between the royal territories and the rival Dawn Pack, it was a harsh, unforgiving place forgotten by the wealthy elite of the high courts. It was a place meant for outcasts, for those who needed to disappear into the grey fog. But for Clara, this remote, rugged settlement was the very first true sanctuary she had ever known in her entire life. Inside the cavernous, stone-walled interior of the village forge, the biting winter frost was aggressively held at bay by the roaring, golden flames of the central hearth. Clara stood near a massive iron anvil, her linen sleeves rolled up past her elbows, a faint smudge of dark charcoal dusting her pale cheek. Her hands, once soft and perfectly manicured to meet the impossible, suffocating standards of the royal pack, were now rough and calloused. They moved with a steady, rhythmic precision as she carefully polished the heavy wooden handle of a newly forged hunting knife. The intense heat radiating from the open fire pressed against her spine like a heavy, comforting blanket, seeping deep into her perpetually aching muscles. She was no longer the invisible, rejected Omega desperately seeking validation from a court of vipers. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. That was the tragic, hollow lie she had repeatedly told herself on the night of the royal mating ceremony, the night she had walked out into a blinding blizzard with nothing but the thin clothes on her back. Instead, it became the moment Clara's entire world shattered, leaving her to rebuild her identity piece by agonizing peace in the quiet, absolute isolation of the mountain borderlands. The heavy, deafening clang of a steel hammer, striking red-hot iron, echoed loudly through the cavernous workshop. Thomas Miller stood on the opposite side of the massive anvil, his towering, muscular frame illuminated by the fierce, shifting golden light of the forge. He was a man deeply connected to the earth, quiet, remarkably patient, and incredibly gentle for a blacksmith, who spent his days brutally bending iron to his unyielding will. Unlike the volatile, highly aggressive alpha males of Clara's past, Thomas moved around her with a calm, deliberate respect. He never crowded her physical space. He never barked arrogant commands. He simply allowed her to exist and breathe at her own pace. Sudden, violent gust of freezing wind howled through the high, open windows of the workshop, carrying the bitter, biting chill of the high mountain pass. Clara shivered instinctively, her shoulders drawing inward as the phantom ache of her severed, fated mate bond pulsed deep within her chest. The cold weather always made the internal emptiness feel significantly heavier, creating a hollow, freezing void exactly where a vibrant, golden thread of magical resonance should have naturally been. Thomas paused mid-strike, the heavy iron hammer freezing in the air. He set the massive tool down on the anvil with a soft clink, the ringing vibration of the metal slowly fading into the ambient crackle of the burning hearth. He did not say a single word as he wiped his soot-stained hands on a thick cloth. "You are freezing again, Clara," Thomas murmured softly, his voice a low, soothing, gravelly rumble that vibrated pleasantly beneath the snapping of the fire. "You work far too hard for someone who doesn't owe this forge a single coin. That stubborn piece of oak isn't going to suddenly run away if you take 5 minutes to sit by the hearth and warm your hands." "If I actually sit down, Thomas, You will inevitably end up trying to polish this delicate oak hilt yourself, Clara replied smoothly, a rare, teasing lilt entering her usually guarded tone. And we both know your massive hands are made strictly for breaking things apart, not making them shine. The very last time you tried to delicately sand a dagger hilt, you snapped the poor wood entirely in two. Thomas huffed loudly, crossing his thick, muscular arms over his broad chest. A genuine, entirely self-deprecating smile tugged at the corner of his bearded jaw, his dark eyes crinkling with quiet amusement. It was a highly stubborn piece of wood, Clara. It clearly had a terrible attitude and needed to be taught a lesson in humility. The sheer, deadpan absurdity of his ridiculous excuse caught Clara completely off guard. A sudden, bright, bubbling sound rose up directly from the deepest, most guarded depths of her chest, entirely bypassing the hollow ache of the severed bond and shattering the thick walls of ice she had built around her traumatized heart. Clara closed her eyes, threw her head back, and laughed. It was not a polite, restrained, terrified little chuckle of a submissive Omega. It was a full, radiant, beautifully clear laugh that echoed brightly off the soot-stained stone walls of the forge and spilled out freely into the freezing, misty valley. It was the undeniable sound of a broken woman who was finally, truly healing. It was the sound of a weary spirit thawing from a long, brutal, endless winter of sorrow. For the very first time in an entire agonizing year, Clara Sterling was genuinely, effortlessly happy. She didn't know that the fragile, quiet piece of brindlewood was already rapidly fracturing just beyond the village borders. She didn't know that the complex negotiations of the Silverpine Treaty, a desperate political border agreement regarding the dangerous encroachment of the rival Dawn Pack, had forced the royal court to travel out to the furthest fringes of their territory. And she definitely didn't know that the obsidian-claiming mark on the Alpha King's chest had been burning exactly like molten lead for 6 agonizing months, driving the ruthless sovereign to the absolute, razor-thin brink of total insanity. Outside the open, heavy double doors of the blacksmith's workshop, the rhythmic, thunderous thud of armored hooves suddenly tore through the quiet morning mist. The sound was sharp, violent, and deeply out of place in the humble, slow-moving sanctuary of the border village. A massive, midnight black royal carriage pulled to a heavy, creaking halt in the muddy street just beyond the forge's entrance. The intricately carved, imposing silver crest of the Valerius royal bloodline gleamed maliciously in the pale, diffused winter light. The carriage horses, massive beasts specifically bred for brutal warfare, snorted thick plumes of white steam into the freezing air, their heavy hooves stomping impatiently in the wet dirt. The carriage door swung violently open with a loud protesting groan of heavy iron hinges. Devon Gentry stepped down first into the mud. The loyal beta advisor looked incredibly ragged, his usually impeccable, silver-laced royal uniform distinctly rumpled. His sharp, highly observant eyes scanned the muddy street with a tense mixture of deep exhaustion and high-stakes alert. He carried a thick, heavy leather-bound scroll tucked securely under his arm, the physical draft of the Silverpine Treaty. Then a second, far more terrifying figure emerged from the deep, velvet-lined shadows of the royal carriage. Alpha King Kaelen Valerius stepped heavily down into the icy sludge of brindlewood. He was a truly terrifying monolith of a male, standing well over 6.5 feet tall, his incredibly broad shoulders wide enough to completely block out the pale morning sun. He wore an immaculate, sweeping royal coat of black boiled leather and dark, heavy fur, specifically designed to project absolute, unquestionable sovereignty to anyone who dared look upon him. But as the king stood fully in the unforgiving light of the morning mist, the devastating, horrifying truth of his physical condition became painfully undeniable. This was absolutely not the untouchable, arrogantly flawless tyrant who had so easily and publicly discarded her. The Alpha King looked entirely, devastatingly hollowed out. His regal cheekbones were brutally sharp, his pale skin stretched far too tight with severe chronic exhaustion. Dark, heavily bruised circles framed his storm-grey eyes that currently burned with a manic, feverish, terrifyingly wild desperation. He carried the heavy, dragging aura of a massive beast that had been slowly, continuously bleeding to death from the inside out for an entire year. Kaelen took a single heavy step forward toward the village square, his polished leather boot sinking deeply into the cold mud, and then he heard it. The fading, highly musical, joyful echo of Clara's unrestrained laughter still hung faintly in the damp, freezing mist, drifting directly out of the open doors of the forge. The Alpha King froze mid-step, his massive body locking up completely into rigid, statue-like stillness. Paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the sound, his head snapped violently toward the open doors of the blacksmith's workshop with terrifying, predatory speed. The heavy, breathless weight of that single morning revelation hung suspended in the damp air, marking an agonizingly silent shift in the Sovereign's world. Hours later, the pale, diffused morning light surrendered entirely to a heavy, oppressive afternoon fog that swallowed the rugged village streets. Clara remained working diligently near the warm hearth of the forge, completely unaware that an apex predator was lurking just beyond the threshold. A bitter afternoon draught swept violently through the high stone archway, biting sharply at Clara's exposed skin. She shivered, pausing to rub her calloused hands together against the deep, creeping cold. Thomas noticed her discomfort instantly. With quiet reverence, his large, calloused hands picked up the lunar shawl, a beautifully woven, heavy garment of deep crimson and silver wool that he had specifically traded 3 prized iron broadswords for at the autumn market. He stepped up closely behind Clara, his massive physical presence, offering an impenetrable shelter rather than the suffocating intimidation she was so accustomed to. With slow, exceptionally careful movements, Thomas draped the thick, warm wool smoothly over her shivering shoulders. He did not let his hands linger inappropriately on her skin. He did not press a heavy, possessive dominance into the gesture. He simply pulled the soft edges of the shawl snug around her collar, ensuring the bitter mountain draught could no longer reach her fragile frame. Clara reached up slowly, her slender fingers brushing the soft, rich texture of the crimson lunar shawl. A profound, overwhelming sensation of domestic safety washed over her tired soul. It was just a small, quiet act of everyday care, but to a battered woman who had spent her entire existence silently begging for basic decency and recognition, it felt like an absolute, world-shifting revelation. She did not have to earn her right to be warm in this place. But as Clara smoothed the edges of the heavy wool, the ambient temperature in the workshop seemed to abruptly, terrifyingly plummet. The roaring, comforting heat of the hearth was instantly suffocated by an overwhelming, oppressive aura of ancient frost, terrifying dominance, and pure, concentrated panic. It was a dark, heavy energy she recognized instantly in the deepest, most primal marrow of her bones. Her pulse spiked violently into a frantic, terrified, echoing rhythm against her ribs. Clara spun toward the heavy double doors, her breath catching painfully in her throat. Through the slowly drifting smoke and the dense, freezing afternoon fog, her widened gaze violently collided with Kaelen's turbulent gaze. He was standing completely exposed in the muddy street, watching them from the shadows of his royal carriage. The sudden, unexpected impact of their eye contact was a massive, physical, somatic explosion. Deep within Clara's chest, the long-dormant, forcibly severed, fated mate bond flared with a sudden, agonizing jolt of searing, blinding heat, stealing the very breath directly from her lungs. She stumbled backward away from the anvil, her trembling hand flying up to clutch at her chest. But the physiological reaction was infinitely, catastrophically worse for the Alpha King. Clara watched in stunned silence as the terrifying sovereign physically broke apart before her very eyes. As Kaelen's burning, golden gaze tracked frantically over Clara's completely unharmed form, His eyes suddenly snagged heavily on the thick crimson and silver fabric draped intimately, protectively over her small shoulders, the lunar shawl. He looked slightly past her trembling frame, registering the towering, muscular, intensely protective stance of Thomas Miller standing just inches behind her. Kaelen, visibly, violently staggered backward under the agonizing pain of a massive somatic flare. A low, ragged, distinctly animalistic gasp tore its way painfully out of his throat, completely and utterly stripping away his carefully maintained royal composure in a fraction of a second. His massive, gauntleted hand flew up to his chest, his thick fingers digging frantically, desperately into the heavy leather of his coat, as if he were trying to violently claw out the burning, throbbing crescent soul brand right from beneath his own skin. His silvery dark irises widened in pure, unadulterated shock, the irises shifting rapidly, bleeding into a burning, molten gold as his inner wolf surged dangerously, violently close to the surface. Clara stared at the terrifying man who had once commanded legions with a single breath, watching as his massive knees physically buckled under the weight of his unendurable agony. He stood completely paralyzed in the bitter muck, trembling violently from head to toe. Clara could see the devastating, harrowing reality etched deeply into the lines of his pale, drawn face. He looked at the warm, beautifully safe sanctuary she had built with another man, and his expression crumbled into an image of sheer, helpless horror, appearing completely overwhelmed by the undeniable physical truth that he had permanently destroyed his only chance at salvation. The icy, black mud of the Brindlewood street immediately seeped through the thick, pristine, boiled leather of the monarch's trousers. It soaked into his skin like a physical manifestation of his own rotting sins. Kaelen Valerius, the apex predator who had slaughtered rival armies without blinking, remained utterly paralyzed in the dirt. He gasped for air that absolutely refused to fill his burning lungs. For a man who had spent his entire sovereign reign dictating the absolute fate of thousands, the sheer, sudden loss of his own bodily autonomy was a catastrophic psychological fracture. The freezing rain continued to pour down, plastering his silver hair to his pale forehead. He could not command his massive legs to rise. He could not force his rigid spine to straighten. The towering, unbreakable ruler was entirely pinned to the freezing earth by the crushing, astronomical weight of a single, devastating revelation. She was genuinely, radiantly happy. Her breathtaking joy had absolutely nothing to do with him, and the agonizing realization was a lethal poison sinking straight into his bones. The ancient claiming scar branded deeply over his heart screamed in pure, agonizing ruin. It was no longer the dull, hollow ache of a neglected bond that had haunted his sleepless nights in the high capital, triggered by the undeniable visual of another male providing his mate with warmth. The ancient mark flared into an active, violently corrosive acid burning through his veins. The mystical resonance that should have been a vibrant, golden thread of shared magic was currently violently rejecting him. It was brutally punishing his nervous system for the arrogant cruelty he had inflicted upon her a year ago. He clutched at the heavy fur collar of his royal coat, his thick, collused fingers twisted frantically into the dark fabric as a wet, ragged gasp tore its way up his paralyzed throat. Every single beat of his frantic heart felt like a jagged, serrated blade twisting mercilessly between his ribs. It was a somatic retribution demanding payment for the sanctuary he had systematically denied her. The searing heat inside his chest stood in agonizing contrast to the bitter winter frost biting at his exposed hands, a perfect physical mirror of his isolated, barren existence. Just a few feet away, standing beside the opulent midnight black carriage, Devon Gentry stared at his fallen sovereign in absolute, unadulterated horror. The loyal beta advisor had witnessed his king endure brutal battlefield wounds, poisoned arrows, and the exhausting, grueling trials of court politics without ever dropping to a single knee. Seeing the most feared monarch in the Northern Territories physically crumble into the slush over the mere sight of a village blacksmith was deeply, fundamentally terrifying. The heavy, leather-bound Silverpine Treaty slipped completely forgotten from Devon's trembling grip, landing with a dull, wet smack in a dirty puddle. Acting entirely on raw instinct, the advisor rushed forward. His polished boots splashed wildly through the freezing sludge as he reached out with both hands. Devon was desperate to haul his sovereign back to his feet before the few peering villagers could witness the total destruction of their ruler's unassailable dignity. But the moment Devon's fingers brushed the dark fur of the royal coat, a low, distinctly feral snarl erupted from the depths of Kaelen's chest. The king shoved his loyal second away with a violent, terrifyingly forceful jerk of his broad shoulder. His frantic, molten gold eyes were completely incapable of breaking contact with the illuminated doorway of the forge. He did not want to be helped. He fundamentally believed he belonged exactly where he was, rotting in the freezing filth at the absolute lowest point of her world. Inside the cavernous, stone-walled workshop, the ambient temperature seemed to completely stagnate. It was caught in a suffocating, terrifying vacuum between the biting winter fog and the roaring central hearth. Thomas Miller did not cower. He did not instinctively bare his throat in biological submission, nor did he transform into a defensive beast at the sudden, overwhelming exposure to a supreme royal aura. The massive blacksmith simply shifted his heavy weight. He stepped with slow, deliberate, incredibly calm precision until he was standing completely between Clara and the open threshold. He became an immovable mountain of earth and fire, a quiet, devastatingly domestic shield designed to completely block the Alpha's predatory line of sight. Thomas did not need fangs or claws to defend his forge. His unwavering, protective stance was a sovereign declaration of its own. His jaw tightened in silent warning, one massive hand resting casually but firmly on the heavy iron pommel of a forging hammer at his belt, refusing to yield a single inch of ground to the broken king. From his pathetic vantage point in the mud, Kaelen stared at the enormous soot-stained hands of the rival male. Those collused, rough hands had just draped a thick, crimson lunar shawl over Clara's fragile shoulders. Thomas performed the action with a level of exquisite, reverent care that Kaelen himself had never once demonstrated. A sickening, deeply humiliating wave of absolute clarity crashed violently over the broken king. He was not experiencing a toxic, possessive rage toward the blacksmith. The ferocious jealousy tearing through his burning veins was directed entirely at his own unforgivable failures. He looked at the gentle giant standing in the warm light, and he realized with terrifying certainty that Thomas was simply a fundamentally better man. The blacksmith knew how to build, how to protect, and how to nurture warmth in a harsh environment. In devastating contrast, Kaelen's royal hands only knew how to conquer, demand, and destroy. Clara stood perfectly still behind the broad, protective wall of her friend's back. The initial, terrifying spike of the severed tether had struck her like a physical blow to the sternum. It stole the breath from her lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. The phantom connection vibrated wildly, echoing with the sovereign's desperate, suffocating panic and profound regret. But as she instinctively raised her trembling fingers to grip the soft lunar shawl resting over her collar, the severe physiological panic began to rapidly recede. The heavy fabric smelled richly of dry pine, sweet wood smoke, and steady, uncompromising safety. The crimson lunar shawl physically grounded her in the present reality, wrapping her traumatized nervous system in a protective layer of undeniable security. She was no longer the invisible, terrified Omega, desperately begging for a single scrap of validation at the foot of an obsidian throne. She took a slow, deep, incredibly steadying breath, deliberately forcing the frantic, erratic rhythm of her heart to slow down. The thick, icy walls she had meticulously built around her emotions over the past 12 months did not shatter under the sudden pressure of his arrival. Instead, they crystallized, hardening into an impenetrable fortress of absolute self-preservation. Clara closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, entirely severing her emotional response to the agonizing pain flooding through their mystical tether. She would not carry his burden anymore. Her own survival was a hard-won victory, and she refused to let his sudden weeping regret drag her back into the abyss. Slowly, agonizingly, the fallen monarch forced his massive, trembling frame to move. Kaelen planted one heavily gauntleted hand directly into the freezing, filthy slush of the street. He utilized every single ounce of his remaining physical strength to push his broad shoulders upward. The sheer, monumental effort required to lift his own body weight made his thick muscles shake violently beneath his wet leather coat. Mud dripped heavily from his pristine trousers, smearing across the immaculate royal crest, stamped onto his silver belt buckle. His majestic, terrifyingly flawless aura was completely, irrevocably shattered. It was replaced entirely by the pathetic, desperate gravity of a starving, freezing beast drawn helplessly toward a locked and unyielding door. He dragged his heavy boots through the muck, fighting against his own failing biology just to remain upright. He took a single, dragging step toward the high stone archway of the forge, crossing the invisible boundary between the biting, oppressive fog of the street and the golden, flickering hearth light spilling out from the workshop. The temperature clash was visceral, sending violent shivers down his broad spine. Kaelen stopped exactly at the edge of the threshold, his tall, imposing figure completely blocking the pale winter light. He looked absolutely devastated. He was a haunting, ghostly shell of the arrogant tyrant who had once dismissed her as a defective liability. His silver hair was plastered wetly against his pale forehead by the damp mist, and his chest heaved with shallow, ragged, deeply painful breaths. "Clara," he whispered. The name tore its way out of his throat like a bleeding open wound. It was not a command. It was not a royal decree delivered with the booming, unquestionable authority of an apex predator. It was a ragged, breathless, entirely broken sound. It was laced heavily with a year of chronic exhaustion, unbearable isolation, and endless, weeping regret. The way his lips formed the syllables was incredibly reverent, as if he were speaking the sacred name of a forgotten goddess he had foolishly banished from his own temple. The absolute vulnerability in that single word was a stark betrayal of everything the Alpha King stood for, laying bare his shattered soul for the entire world to witness. Clara did not flinch at the devastating, sorrowful gravity in his voice. Exhibiting quiet, dignified grace, she stepped out from behind the protective bulk of the blacksmith. She chose to stand completely visible, shoulder to shoulder with her towering friend. Her posture was impeccably straight, her chin tilted slightly upward in a silent, powerful declaration of her own hard-earned sovereignty. She wore a simple, rough linen apron covered in dark charcoal dust, yet she carried herself with significantly more majestic authority than the broken king standing in the mud before her. She was no longer a subject meant to be discarded. She was a woman who had forged her own unbreakable strength in the fires of exile. Kaelen had expected her to be furious. He had deeply, desperately expected her to scream at him, to hurl burning insults about on his cruelty, to weep over the agonizing injustice of her public humiliation. He would have gladly accepted her blistering rage, because anger was at least a form of connection. It was a tangible emotion he could hold on to, a fiery spark that proved she still cared enough to hate him. But as his desperate, feverish gaze locked onto her face, he found absolutely no warmth, no fury, and no sorrow. Her slate-colored eyes were a completely flat, unreadable surface of thick, impenetrable winter ice. She looked at the most powerful male in 3 realms exactly as if he were a lost, remarkably inconvenient stranger blocking the entrance to her workplace. "You are trespassing," Clara stated smoothly, her tone ringing with absolute, terrifying calm. She offered no formal title. There was no respectful dip of her head, no desperate use of the word alpha, and absolutely no acknowledgement of his supreme royal status. The casual, deliberate omission of his sovereign title hit Kaelen's chest harder than a physical blow from a heavy iron mace. He physically recoiled, his broad shoulders curling inward as another violent spasm of pain radiated directly from the severed fated tether anchored in his chest. The absolute lack of fear in her voice was the most terrifying weapon she could have wielded, systematically dismantling the fragile remnants of his authority. "Please," Kaelen choked out, his voice trembling so severely it barely carried over the crackle of the hearth fire. He reached out a large, shaking hand toward the glowing warmth of the forge, his long, mud-stained fingers desperate to bridge the agonizing physical distance separating their bodies. The rain continued to batter his broad back, a freezing torment that paled in comparison to the agony of her cold stare. "Please, I have searched everywhere, the entire continent. You belong to the capital. You belong to the pack. I cannot breathe without you. The bond is actively killing me. You must return." Clara tilted her head very slightly to the side, observing his pathetic, trembling desperation with the clinical, detached curiosity of a healer examining a wound she had no intention of treating. She reached her callosed hands up, casually adjusting the soft edges of the crimson lunar shawl draped safely around her neck. It was a small, quiet gesture that explicitly reminded him of exactly who was providing her warmth now. "I belong to absolutely no one who requires my silent suffering to maintain their own illusion of power," she replied. Her voice echoed off the stone walls with a profound, terrifying authority that made the nearby beta advisor physically shiver in the cold mist. "And as for your grand royal pack, you are severely mistaken. Your ledgers hold no sway over me here." Kaelen blinked, his golden irises contracting sharply in deep, panicked confusion. A fresh, icy wave of sheer terror began to flood his veins, chilling the boiling acid of his severed tether. He took a tiny, hesitant half-step forward, his boots squelching loudly in the damp dirt. He was visibly terrified of her calm, unwavering demeanor. "What do you mean?" He rasped, his wide, desperate eyes searching her calm face for any sign of a bluff. "You are bound to my ledgers. You were born under my crest. You are my mate by the laws of the ancestors. When I crossed the treacherous mountain border during that blinding blizzard, I did not merely run away to hide in the woods," Clara explained, her voice vibrating with the breathtaking, hard-won triumph of her own liberation, entirely dismantling the very foundation of his arrogant assumption. "I claimed the ancient sanctuary laws of the Dawn Pack. By bleeding for this village and offering my labor to this forge for a full year, I earned the unconditional protection of a new pack. I am a free, recognized citizen of these territories. My registration was legally and permanently severed from your Silverpine archives 6 months ago." The devastating, horrific reality of her words crashed down upon the monarch like a collapsing stone fortress. She hadn't just left his physical proximity. She had systematically, legally, and spiritually erased her existence from his entire domain. She had surgically excised him from her life, cutting away the toxic rot of his cruel authority. In its place, she had rebuilt a new, entirely separate identity where he held absolutely zero power. He was no longer her alpha. He was absolutely nothing to her. The absolute finality of her actions left him gasping for air, drowning in a sea of his own unchangeable mistakes. "No," Kaelen breathed, a violent, full-body tremor racking his massive frame as the ultimate, inescapable truth finally locked into place. "No, you cannot do that. You are mine. You are my mate." Clara simply stared at the towering beast, trembling in the filthy mud, feeling a strange, profound sense of quiet liberation wash over her weary soul. The man who had effortlessly broken her heart in front of thousands was now completely destroyed by a few simple administrative words, spoken in a quiet room. The devastating irony of their reversed positions hung heavily in the damp air. "Thank you for letting me go," Clara murmured, her words slicing through the heavy, tense air with beautiful poetic finality. Because being let go allowed me to be found by a better man, a quiet life, and a true sanctuary, I will never, ever look back. The Alpha King's heart completely stopped. The agonizing, fiery torment of his crescent obsidian, claiming mark pulsed one final, excruciating time before rapidly plunging into a deep necrotic, absolute zero cold. The suffocating, terrifying realization of his permanent loss ripped the last remaining shred of his royal pride directly from his bones. He dropped his heavy head, tears of pure, unbroken despair mixing freely with the freezing rain. The terrifying ruler who had conquered entire kingdoms and buried rival armies finally understood the devastating truth. He could not conquer the quiet, unyielding boundaries of a woman who had finally recognized her own sovereign worth. The heavy, iron-reinforced double doors of the blacksmith's workshop swung shut with a slow, agonizing finality. The thick oak severed the golden, flickering hearthlight from the gloomy, freezing street, plunging the outside world back into oppressive winter shadows. With the dull, echoing thud of those closing doors, the last fragile tether to Kaelen Valerius's sanity violently snapped. He remained on his hands and knees in the freezing, filthy slush of brindlewood. The once mighty Alpha King, a terrifying sovereign who had ruthlessly conquered rival territories, was now indistinguishable from a starving, broken beggar. The freezing rain battering against his broad back soaked through the expensive boiled leather of his royal coat, but the external weather was nothing compared to the catastrophic necrotic winter actively destroying his internal organs. The crescent obsidian claiming mark branded over his heart, once a vibrant, throbbing testament to their fated connection, had gone terrifyingly dark. The broken crescent mark didn't just contain his pain. It created a void, an absolute, freezing absence where his sovereign magic and soul should naturally be. It was a suffocating, bottomless abyss that violently sucked all the oxygen directly from his lungs. Every single frantic beat of his heart pumped lethal frost through his veins, a severe physiological punishment for the devastating arrogance he had displayed a year ago. He had arrogantly assumed that a fated mate bond was an unbreakable chain of possession, a biological guarantee that she would wait endlessly in the shadows for his meager scraps of attention. He was catastrophically wrong. Devon Gentry stood frozen near the massive wooden wheels of the opulent midnight black royal carriage, his polished boots sinking deep into the mud. The loyal beta advisor was physically trembling, his sharp eyes wide with unadulterated horror. He had followed his king into brutal, bloody wars. He had watched Kaelen take a poisoned arrow to the shoulder during the Southern rebellions, and simply tear the jagged metal out without breaking his terrifying stride. But this weeping surrender in the mud over the quiet rejection of a single, low status was fundamentally terrifying. It shattered the invulnerable myth of the Valerius bloodline in a matter of seconds. "My king," Devon pleaded, his voice a frantic, desperate rasp that barely cut through the howling mountain wind. He took a hesitant, splashing step forward, entirely ignoring the heavy, leather-bound Silverpine Treaty still lying ruined in a dirty puddle at his feet. The political document that had brought them to this wretched border village was now utterly meaningless. "Kaelen, please. You must rise. You cannot remain here in the dirt. The Dawn Pack border patrols could arrive at any moment. If they see you like this, if they witness the supreme alpha of the Silverpine territories completely incapacitated, it will mean absolute political ruin for the entire court." Kaelen did not move. He did not issue a sharp, commanding roar to silence his advisor's panic. He did not slowly rise to his feet to project the terrifying, unbreakable authority that had defined his entire reign. He simply stayed anchored to the freezing earth, his broad shoulders curling inward as another violent, agonizing sob tore its way painfully out of his throat. His massive hands that had callously signed her exile papers without a single second thought, dug desperately into the icy mud, his blunt claws extending in a helpless display of feral grief. "Leave me. Kaelen choked out, the words barely more than a wet, ragged whisper. The sound was so incredibly shattered, so deeply stripped of all royal dignity, that Devon physically recoiled as if he had been struck across the face. "Take the carriage, and take the guard. Return to the capital. I will absolutely not abandon you in this wretched border village," Devon insisted, his tone rising in genuine protective panic. He rushed forward, completely disregarding the dangerous, feral aura radiating from his fallen sovereign. Devon dropped to one knee in the freezing sludge, reaching out to grip the thick, soaking wet fur of Kaelen's collar. "The carriage is warm. We can retreat to the secure encampment. We can consult the royal healers to soothe the physical necrosis of the severed bond. But you must get off the ground, Kaelen. Please, do not let them see you like this." The Alpha King's head snapped up, his storm-grey eyes flashing with a terrifying, manic, feverish desperation. The irises bled rapidly into a burning, molten gold, the inner beast surging violently against the confines of his failing human flesh. "Do you not understand, Devon?" Kaelen snarled, his voice vibrating with a raw, guttural agony that visibly shook the damp air between them. "There is absolutely no healing this. There is no royal remedy, no brilliant political maneuver, and no army that can conquer the boundaries she has set. The royal healers cannot fix a soul that has been legally, permanently severed." Kaelen aggressively shoved his advisor's hands away, his massive chest heaving with shallow, agonizing gasps. He turned his desperate, weeping gaze back toward the closed wooden doors of the forge. Behind that heavy oak she was safe. Behind that oak she was warm, and most devastatingly of all, behind that oak she was being fiercely protected by Thomas, a gentle blacksmith, who had recognized her immeasurable worth when Kaelen had only seen a defective liability. When he had publicly chosen his political duties over her quiet devotion, she vanished, like smoke through a crack in the world, leaving him with an empire of ash. "If I step into that carriage," Kaelen whispered, the feral gold in his eyes slowly drowning in a fresh wave of blinding, helpless tears. "If I put even a single mile of physical distance between my chest and this village, the bond will execute me. It will stop my heart before we even reach the mountain pass. The absolute only thing keeping my lungs drawing breath, her proximity. I cannot leave her. I will never, ever leave her again." Devon stared at the broken titan, kneeling in the mud, finally realizing the absolute, terrifying gravity of the situation. The midnight black royal carriage meant absolutely nothing. It was a useless, hollow monument to a kingdom that Kaelen no longer cared about ruling. The Alpha King had unconditionally surrendered his crown the exact moment he realized that the only treasure in the world that mattered was currently wrapping herself in a crimson lunar shawl provided by another man. "Then what are we to do?" Devon asked, his voice breaking with deep, helpless exhaustion. He looked around the desolate, foggy street of Brindlewood, realizing that the supreme sovereign of the North was entirely at the mercy of a woman who had explicitly vowed to never look back. "You will wait," Kaelen replied, his voice entirely devoid of hope, ringing only with the hollow echo of a man accepting his own execution. "And I will stay right here, in the mud, exactly where I belong." As the afternoon bled away, the remaining slivers of pale daylight were entirely swallowed by the encroaching dusk. The violent, bruising evening tempest outside the modest wooden cottage showed absolutely no signs of relenting, its ferocious winds battering the sturdy walls with a relentless, deafening rhythm that directly echoed the chaotic turmoil tearing through the very fabric of the border territory. Inside her quiet, cedar-scented sanctuary, Clara Sterling remained perfectly still in her rocking chair, staring blankly at the flickering golden flames of the central hearth. She had deliberately closed the thick linen curtain. She had deliberately turned her back on the freezing window. She had actively, consciously chosen to let the terrifying sovereign who had ruthlessly destroyed her past suffer the brutal consequences of his own catastrophic arrogance in the frigid dirt of Brindlewood. Let the merciless storm claim what the corrupt court had forged. She owed him nothing, absolutely nothing. But the ancient, primal magic of the fated mate bond was a profoundly stubborn, invasive force that did not easily submit to the rational boundaries of a traumatized mind. Even legally severed, even spiritually rejected by the unwavering authority of the Dawn Pack sanctuary law, the phantom tether vibrating deep within the scarred tissue of her chest began to emit a frantic, suffocating distress signal. It was no longer the dull, rhythmic ache of a neglected connection that she had endured for the past 12 months. It was the sharp, jagged, undeniably visceral sensation of a massive, apex predator actively bleeding to death in the dark. The somatic necrosis radiating from Kaelen Valerius's failing biology was bleeding through the mystical ether, sending terrifying waves of absolute zero cold washing directly over her own perfectly warm skin. She could literally feel his magnificent, terrifying heart stuttering as the ancient soul brand devoured his internal heat from the inside out. Clara slowly lowered her ceramic cup of herbal tea to the small wooden table beside her, the porcelain clinking softly against the heavy timber. Her calloused hands were trembling very slightly, not from any lingering fear of the formidable Alpha King, but from the overwhelming, crushing weight of her own inescapable empathy. She had spent an entire agonizing year meticulously building a sanctuary of warmth, quiet respect, and unyielding safety in this rugged border village, working alongside the patient and protective Thomas Miller. If she simply sat by the fire and allowed a man to physically perish from exposure and heartbreak just beyond her garden gate, she would be allowing the toxic, merciless cruelty of the Silverpine Court to successfully infect her new home. She would be proving that his heartless indifference had fundamentally changed her into a creature as cold and unfeeling as he was. She was not a monster. She was a woman who had forged an unbreakable, quiet resilience out of the shattered fragments of her public humiliation. Taking a slow, incredibly deep breath to steady her racing pulse, the resilient woman stood up from the comfortable rocking chair, gathering the heavy, beautifully woven crimson lunar shawl closer to her chest to ward off the invading chill. She drew a profound sense of strength from the lingering scent of sweet wood smoke, woven tightly into the wool, and Thomas Miller's unconditional, protective respect, letting it anchor her before facing the architect of her ruin. Her footsteps were virtually silent on the braided rug as she crossed the small, dimly lit room toward the heavy oak door. Clara paused for a fraction of a second, her slender fingers resting lightly against the cold iron latch. She vividly remembered the countless, agonizing hours she had spent, standing entirely unnoticed outside the grand, cavernous council chambers of the capital, desperately praying for this exact man to simply open the door and acknowledge her existence, to see her worth beyond her supposedly defective wolf. The devastating irony of the present moment hung heavily in the fragrant air of the cottage. The supreme monarch who had once viewed her as a completely invisible, highly inconvenient shadow was now rotting in the freezing sludge, entirely dependent on her willingness to turn a simple iron mechanism. With a smooth, decisive motion, Clara lifted the heavy iron bar and pulled the front door open. The last pale shreds of daylight had completely surrendered to the encroaching evening. The brutal, raging tempest instantly invaded the quiet sanctuary of the porch, unleashing a violent gust of biting wind that aggressively tore at her dark hair. The sheer, physical force of the storm was breathtaking, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and the deep, earthy musk of drowning pine needles. Freezing rain immediately lashed against her pale face, soaking the delicate hem of her simple linen dress in a matter of seconds. But she did not flinch. She did not instinctively retreat back into the golden, protective warmth of her home. From the deep shadows of the doorway behind her, Thomas Miller stepped silently into view. The blacksmith did not attempt to interfere or speak a single word, but his broad frame stood as a solid, immovable testament to the sanctuary she had found. His protective presence offered a quiet, unyielding anchor of support as Clara stepped deliberately over the threshold, her chin tilted slightly upward, projecting the absolute, undeniable sovereignty of a true queen stepping onto a chaotic battlefield. Every single element of the freezing night tried to push her back, but she remained completely immovable. Down at the absolute edge of her small property, standing completely exposed to the torrential downpour behind the low wooden fence, Kaelen's head snapped up with terrifying predatory speed. The heavy, bruised, purple darkness of the violent storm was suddenly pierced by the warm, flickering hearthlight spilling out from her open doorway. The fallen monarch stared at the beautiful, backlit silhouette standing on the porch, his burning, molten gold eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. For the past 2 hours, he had been rapidly, inexorably drowning in a suffocating abyss of his own necrotic despair, completely paralyzed by the agonizing pain radiating from his ruined obsidian-claiming mark. He was entirely convinced that the thick linen curtain was the absolute final verdict on his doomed existence. Seeing her willingly step out into the fading daylight's freezing deluge to face him was a seismic, world-shattering revelation that completely short-circuited his failing nervous system. He could not breathe. He could only stare at her as if she were a descending goddess of pure, radiant mercy sent to witness his execution. Clara walked slowly down the 3 wooden steps, her ruined slippers sinking immediately into the freezing, treacherous black slush of the garden path. She moved with exquisite, deliberate grace, completely unbothered by the violent rain, plastering her garments to her shivering frame. Every single step she took toward the perimeter fence was a methodical, powerful deconstruction of the vast, insurmountable societal distance he had once violently enforced between them. She did not rush. She did not demonstrate any frantic, deeply ingrained Omega panic. She simply approached the gate with the calm, terrifying authority of a judge, descending to deliver a final, inescapable sentence. The sodden earth swallowed her footsteps, but she remained entirely anchored in her own unshakable power. When she finally reached the low wooden barrier, Clara stopped. She stood barely 2 feet away from the towering, broad-shouldered beast, the heavy wooden gate acting as the only physical boundary between her hard-won freedom and his catastrophic ruin. She looked directly up into his face. The visual reality of his physical deterioration was profoundly devastating up close. The terrifying sovereign, who had routinely commanded legions of lethal warriors without ever breaking a sweat, was currently shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. His pristine silver-laced boiled leather coat was saturated with filthy mud and freezing rain, hanging heavily from his gaunt frame, like the tattered banners of a thoroughly defeated army. The dark, horrific rotting sensation, spreading aggressively from his chest, had leached every single ounce of color from his aristocratic features, leaving his skin a terrifying, translucent shade of deathly pale. But it was his eyes that truly revealed the absolute magnitude of his destruction. They were entirely shattered, flooded with a bottomless, weeping agony that stripped away every last illusion of his royal invincibility. He looked entirely broken, a hollow shell of the invincible warlord who had once ruled the Silverpine territories with an iron fist. "Clara," he breathed, the beautiful, sacred name tearing out of his throat in a wet, jagged rasp that was immediately swallowed by a deafening crack of rolling thunder. The sheer desperation in that single word carried the immense weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. And then the absolute unthinkable happened. The Alpha King of the Silverpine territories, the ruthless warlord who had never bowed to any foreign ruler, who had never compromised a single political demand, and who had never ever begged for mercy in his entire violent life, completely collapsed. His massive knees violently buckled beneath his immense weight. He dropped straight down into the freezing, filthy abyss of the flooded street, his heavy boots splashing wildly in the dark muck. The sickening, heavy thud of his body hitting the earth vibrated through the wooden planks of the gate. Kaelen Valerius surrendered his crown, his pride, and his entire formidable existence to the mud, burying the immaculate silver crest of his royal bloodline deep within the icy mire at her feet. It was the ultimate, visually staggering status reversal, a devastating portrait of a supreme titan brought entirely to ruin by the quiet, unyielding absence of the woman he had carelessly discarded. The rain washed over him mercilessly, but he made absolutely no effort to shield himself from the punishing downpour. He was openly, uncontrollably weeping. The hot, frantic tears streamed freely down his pale cheeks, mixing indistinguishably with the freezing rain battering his broad shoulders. He did not attempt to hide his profound vulnerability. He did not try to mask the feral, humiliating sobs violently racking his massive chest. He simply knelt in the sludge, his broad shoulders curling inward, appearing impossibly small despite his terrifying physical size. Every harsh, ragged breath he took was an agonizing confession of his catastrophic failure. "I am a monster," the broken king choked out, his voice a raw, bleeding wound of pure desperation. He stared up at her from the dirt, his neck craned back, his completely shattered expression begging for a mercy he fundamentally knew he did not deserve. "I was so completely, impossibly blind. Please, please, Clara, the void. The void inside my chest is entirely empty without you. I am drowning in it. I am dying in the dark, and I deserve every single second of this agony. I deserve the wasting chill. I deserve this total annihilation." Clara remained perfectly still on her side of the low wooden gate. Her eyes were incredibly calm, betraying absolutely none of the frantic, panicked urgency that had historically defined her interactions with the royal court. She did not immediately reach out to comfort him. She did not offer empty, soothing platitudes to alleviate the crushing weight of his well-earned guilt. She simply stood in the rain, a quiet, immovable pillar of strength, forcing him to fully occupy the devastating emotional wasteland he had single-handedly created. This was not a moment for gentle forgiveness. It was a profound, necessary reckoning for the destruction of her heart, slowly, hesitantly, as if terrified that any sudden movement would cause her to vanish like an ethereal ghost, back into the warm cottage. Kaelen lifted his massive, trembling hands from the mud. He reached out toward her through the wooden slats of the gate. His thick, calloused fingers, stained deeply with the black earth of the border village, hovered just inches away from her waist. He was desperately, biologically starved for her tactile presence, but he was far too paralyzed by his own unworthiness to actually bridge the final, agonizing gap without her explicit permission. He was waiting for her judgment, his entire existence hanging precariously in the balance of her quiet gaze. She looked down at his shaking, freezing hands. The fated mate bond, despite being legally severed, roared with a deafening biological demand to heal the dying sovereign. Clara took a slow, steadying breath, acknowledging the profound vulnerability in his submissive posture. With deliberate, incredibly careful precision, she reached out and gently laid her smaller, calloused hands directly over his massive, mud-stained fingers. The immediate tactile shock was absolutely staggering. His skin was like literal solid ice. The severe somatic withering originating from his dark claiming scar had entirely stripped his extremities of their natural, radiant werewolf heat. But the exact fraction of a second her warm skin made direct contact with his freezing flesh, a violent, desperate spark of pure, golden resonance flared spectacularly within the suffocating void of his chest. Kaelen gasped, a sharp, incredibly painful intake of breath tearing through his lungs as the agonizingly beautiful sensation of her warmth rushed violently up his arms. It was like pouring molten sunlight directly into a frozen, dead cavern. He clung to her small hands with the terrifying, frantic desperation of a drowning sailor, finally wrapping his bleeding fingers around a solid piece of driftwood. He did not pull her forcefully toward him. He did not attempt to drag her over the boundary of the gate. Instead, the towering beast slumped forward in the mud, pressing his wet, freezing forehead directly against her knuckles, weeping heavily and uncontrollably into her collused skin. The heat transferring between them was a lifesaver he did not believe he was allowed to hold. Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned in the mud, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me. Clara murmured internally, her mind briefly echoing the dangerous, empathetic instinct that always threatened to compromise her boundaries. But she firmly pushed the thought away. She was not going to be destroyed today. She was going to demand absolute systemic accountability from the man who had ordered her destruction. You do not get to simply weep in the rain and expect the past year to magically wash away, Kaelen, Clara stated. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the howling wind and the rolling thunder with the terrifying, lethal precision of a freshly sharpened blade. She forced him to remain exactly where he was, kneeling in the filth, his face pressed against her hands. You do not get to experience a few hours of physical agony and believe you have suddenly paid the insurmountable debt of my humiliation. The fallen monarch flinched violently against her knuckles, his broad shoulders shaking as a fresh wave of agonizing sobs tore through his chest. Every single word she spoke was an absolutely justified, righteous lash across his bleeding soul, and he willingly absorbed the punishment without a single defense. "Do you remember the royal altar?" she continued, her tone dropping into a chilling, methodically calm register that completely paralyzed the surrounding storm. "Do you remember the deafening, suffocating silence of 10,000 wolves when you stood on that raised obsidian dais, draped in the heavy furs of your ancestors, and publicly announced that my wolf was defective? Do you remember the sheer clinical disgust in your eyes when you looked down at me, treating my quiet devotion as if it were a highly offensive stain on your immaculate marble floor? You discarded my love like it was absolutely nothing. I am sorry." Kaelen sobbed, his voice entirely muffled against her skin, his freezing tears washing the mud from her fingers. "I was a fool. I was a blind, arrogant fool poisoned by the elders. Please, Clara, the pain is tearing my mind apart. I did not cry when you cast me aside." Clara pressed on, completely ignoring his desperate, weeping apologies. She was forcing him to deeply, viscerally understand the exact mechanics of the trauma he had inflicted upon her. "I did not scream. I did not beg for a mercy you were completely incapable of providing. I quietly packed my meager belongings in the dead of the night, while the entire court celebrated your liberation from the weak, wolfless burden. I walked out into a blinding blizzard with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back, carrying the shattered remains of my soul into the freezing wilderness." Kaelen writhed in the icy mire, a low, animalistic keening sound vibrating painfully from the deepest depths of his chest, hearing the raw, unvarnished truth of her agonizing exile spoken aloud was infinitely worse than any physical torture he had ever endured on a battlefield. He was entirely trapped in a prison of his own making, forced to watch the vivid, horrifying mental images of his fragile mate freezing in the snow, while he had remained safely insulated behind the impenetrable stone walls of his fortress. The sheer guilt was a toxic poison eroding his sanity. "I walked through waist-deep snow until my legs burned with lactic fire, and then I walked further still," she whispered, her voice tightening slightly with the heavy, lingering ghost of that desperate survival. "I starved in the outer forests. I bled on the jagged rocks of the mountain pass. I had to violently carve a small, quiet space for my own existence in this rugged village while you sat comfortably on your throne, entirely unbothered by the fact that you had effectively sentenced me to a freezing death. I survived, Kaelen, not because of your merciful restraint, but because I absolutely refuse to let your arrogant cruelty be the final chapter of my story." The Alpha King's massive frame shuddered violently. He slowly lifted his heavy head from her hands, his deeply bruised eyes completely bloodshot and utterly devastated. The feral, manic gold of his inner beast had completely receded, entirely subdued by the overwhelming, unquestionable sovereignty of her truth. He looked up at her, no longer seeing a defective, low-status subject, but a truly terrifying, magnificent force of nature who had conquered an impossible abyss and emerged infinitely stronger than he could ever hope to be. "How do I fix it?" he pleaded, his voice a broken, hollow rasp. His freezing hands tightened gently, reverently around her fingers, completely terrified of applying even a fraction too much pressure. "Show me how to bleed for you. Explain what piece of my soul I must carve out to prove that I am no longer that arrogant tyrant. I will dismantle the entire court. I will burn the capital to the ground and lay the ashes at your feet if you simply ask it of me. I am entirely yours to destroy, Clara, please. Just instruct me on how to survive this." Clara stared down at the weeping, ruined monarch. The ultimate, absolute power dynamic of the Silverpine territories had just been completely, irrevocably inverted in the muddy front yard of a humble blacksmith's cottage. She held the absolute fate of the most terrifying alpha in the northern realms entirely within the palm of her collused hands, and the realization brought a quiet, profound sense of closure to the deepest wounds of her past. She had finally received the absolute validation she had once desperately craved, not through begging, but through the undeniable power of her own silent resilience. The man who had shattered her was now completely shattered in return. "You do not survive this by burning down your kingdom," Clara replied softly, her cool, steady gaze locking directly onto his shattered eyes. "You survive this by staying right here in the bitter slush. Until you fundamentally understand that my warmth is a privilege you must actively earn every single day for the rest of your natural life." Clara let her words hang in the freezing, raisin-soaked air, allowing the absolute, devastating gravity of her sentence to fully penetrate his traumatized mind. Then, with deliberate, agonizingly slow precision, she began to pull her warm, calloused hands away from his desperate grip. The physical separation was a brutal, visceral event. For Kaelen, the sudden loss of her direct skin contact was catastrophic, a violent shock to his already failing nervous system. The radiant golden warmth that had momentarily chased away the suffocating darkness in his chest was violently extinguished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, necrotic frost of his dormant obsidian-claiming mark. But he did not fight her. He did not tighten his thick, mud-stained fingers to forcefully trap her hands in his. A year ago, the arrogant Alpha King would have demanded her immediate compliance, violently pulling her into his chest to satiate his own biological agony. Tonight, the broken man, kneeling in the sludge, simply opened his trembling palms, willingly allowing his absolute only source of salvation to slip entirely through his fingers. He squeezed his eyes shut, his broad shoulders curling inward as he absorbed the agonizing, bone-deep chill without a single syllable of protest. Clara stepped back, her ruined slippers sinking deeper into the icy mud of the garden path. She raised her newly freed hands to the heavy crimson and silver collar of the lunar shawl, pulling the thick, fragrant wool tightly around her shivering frame. The subtle, quiet movement was entirely devastating in its profound implication. The shawl smelled deeply of dried pine and sweet cedar wood smoke, the distinct, earthy scent of Thomas Miller's forge, and the quiet, unconditional protection she had found in the border village of Brindlewood. Kaelen forced his heavy eyelids open, his bloodshot gaze tracking the delicate movement of her fingers against the foreign fabric. Every single thread of that beautiful, warm garment was a vicious, undeniable testament to his own monumental failure. He had draped her in the cold, invisible chains of his royal expectations, demanding she prove her worth while another man had simply noticed she was freezing and offered her a blanket without asking for anything in return. The sheer, overwhelming shame of that reality burned far hotter than the severed tether in his chest, completely incinerating the last remaining fragments of his sovereign pride. If you choose to remain here, you will absolutely not do so as the Alpha King of the Silverpin Territories, Clara continued, her voice ringing with an absolute, uncompromising authority that easily cut through the fading rumble of the thunder. You will not issue royal decrees. You will not order your elite guards to intimidate the people of Brindlewood. You will not demand my presence, my forgiveness, or my physical affection. You have permanently forfeited the right to claim me as your Luna. The woman who stood silently at the obsidian altar, desperately begging for a single scrap of your validation, is completely dead. She froze to death in the mountain pass 12 months ago. She paused, letting the harsh, unvarnished truth settle heavily over his bowed head. Kaelen flinched, as if he had been physically struck by a heavy iron blade, a low, wretched gasp tearing through his constricted throat. He did not attempt to defend himself. He knew every single word she spoke was an absolutely justified execution of his character. The woman standing before you now is a free, sovereign citizen of this territory, Clara stated, her voice trembling slightly, not with legal formality, but with the raw emotional liberation of her hard-won independence. My spirit belongs to the Dawn Pack Sanctuary law, a law that opened its arms to me when you offered only a grave. If you stay as a man entirely stripped of his crown. You will exist on the absolute periphery of my life, a silent protector, rather than a ruling tyrant. You will endure the cold. You will watch me rebuild my existence with my own hands, and you will accept whatever meager boundaries I choose to set. And if you cannot endure the quiet, grueling humility of that existence, then I highly suggest you climb back into your midnight black carriage and return to your empty throne. The towering beast remained on his knees in the freezing black sludge, the torrential downpour plastering his ruined silver hair against his pale, gaunt face. He listened to her terms, the absolute rigid parameters of his new reality, and he felt a strange, profound sense of psychological relief wash over his bleeding soul. She was not offering him a miraculous, unearned absolution. She was not offering him the instant, hollow forgiveness of a submissive Omega. She was offering him a brutal, agonizingly difficult penance, and that was exactly what his guilt-ridden heart desperately required. He needed to be punished. He needed to bleed for her. He needed to systematically dismantle the arrogant monster he had been and forge an entirely new man from the shattered pieces. Slowly, reverently, Kaelen bowed his heavy head until his wet forehead nearly touched the muddy toes of her ruined slippers. It was a gesture of total, unconditional surrender, an ancient pack submission typically reserved only for the divine ancestors. "I accept," Kaelen whispered, his wrecked, raspy voice completely devoid of any remaining royal ego. The sound was incredibly raw, scraping painfully past his exhausted vocal cords. "I accept every single condition, Clara. I do not want the throne. I do not want the capital. I only want the absolute privilege of breathing the same air as you. I will be your shadow. I will be the shield at your back. I will wait in the cold for a century, if that is what it takes to prove that I am no longer the tyrant who broke you. I am yours to command, completely and utterly." Clara stared down at the weeping titan, her chest tightening with a complex, painfully raw mixture of lingering sorrow and undeniable vindication. She searched his devastated, mud-stained features for any trace of the cold, unfeeling warlord who had so easily cast her aside. There was absolutely nothing left of that monster, because monsters do not kneel in the icy dirt of a forgotten border village, because monsters do not willingly embrace the physical agony of a severed bond for an entire year, because monsters do not look at her with such profound, shattering reverence, completely willing to tear out their own hearts just to keep her hands warm. The man kneeling before her was completely broken, entirely hollowed out and desperately ready to be remade by her quiet strength, as if the violent, atmospheric tempest had been directly tied to the catastrophic internal war raging within the Alpha King's soul. The brutal weather finally began to exhaust its terrifying fury. The torrential, punishing downpour slowly tapered off into a soft, steady, freezing drizzle. The deafening, aggressive cracks of rolling thunder gradually retreated behind the jagged peaks of the distant mountain range, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence that enveloped the rugged streets of Brindlewood. A sudden, piercing gust of biting wind swept through the valley, pushing the heavy, bruised purple clouds apart to reveal a tiny, fragmented sliver of pale silver moonlight. The ethereal, ghostly illumination cascaded down through the misty fog, casting long, dramatic shadows across the muddy garden path. The soft light caught the wet, ruined silver crest stamped onto Kaelen's heavy leather belt, highlighting the absolute destruction of his royal facade. Clara remained standing behind the low wooden gate, her breathing slow and steady, her internal emotional landscape mirroring the sudden fragile calm of the clearing sky. The agonizing, frantic distress signal of the severed fated mate bond had finally quieted. The mystical tether still pulsed with a dull, heavy ache behind her ribs, but the immediate, terrifying threat of his somatic death had passed. By fully explicitly submitting to her rigid boundaries, Kaelen had momentarily pacified the ancient magic, proving to the ancestors that he was finally willing to respect the sacred balance he had previously violated. Further down the desolate, flooded street, partially obscured by the lingering winter fog, Beta Devon Gentry stood completely motionless near the massive wheels of the royal carriage. The loyal advisor had watched the entire, devastating confrontation unfold in absolute, stunned silence. He had witnessed the most powerful sovereign in the Northern Territories systematically strip away his own invincibility and willingly hand the absolute power of his existence to a rejected Omega. Devon felt a profound, chilling shiver run down his spine, recognizing that the political landscape of the Silverpine Court had just been irrevocably altered forever. Kaelen Valerius was no longer a king leading an army. He was a desperate, repentant pilgrim, bound entirely to the quiet sanctuary of Brindlewood. The midnight black carriage would eventually return to the capital empty. The obsidian throne would remain completely vacant. The Alpha King had finally found his true ruler, and she wore a simple linen dress and a blacksmith's woolen shawl. "Stand up, Kaelen," Clara instructed softly, her voice breaking the heavy, misty silence with quiet, unyielding authority. It was not a request, but it was also entirely devoid of the cruel, barking dominance he used to employ in the capital. Kaelen inhaled a sharp, ragged breath, planting his large, mud-stained hands firmly into the freezing slush. He pushed his massive, exhausted frame upward, his broad shoulders shaking violently with a monumental physical effort. When he finally stood fully upright, his towering height still easily eclipsed her small, fragile frame, but his physical presence was entirely transformed. He did not puff out his chest. He did not square his massive shoulders to project an intimidating, predatory aura. His posture was deeply bowed, his chin tucked respectfully downward, keeping his silver-flecked eyes carefully lowered so he would not inadvertently challenge her absolute sovereignty. He was a colossal, lethal weapon that had voluntarily chosen to sheathe itself in her presence. The dark mud dripped heavily from his ruined coat, a visceral, physical manifestation of the filthy, toxic pride he had finally managed to shed. Clara observed his careful, deliberate submission, feeling the quiet, steady rhythm of her own heart, anchoring her in the present moment. She had survived the deepest, most terrifying abyss of emotional abandonment, and she had emerged as an unbreakable force of nature. She did not need to run anymore. She did not need to hide in the shadows of the forge. She had looked the architect of her destruction directly in the eye, and he had blinked first. With a slow, graceful movement, Clara reached out and unlatched the low wooden gate. The rusted iron hinges squeaked softly in the damp night air as the barrier swung open, creating a narrow, highly symbolic pathway between the freezing, desolate street and the warm, protected sanctuary of her garden path. She did not step aside to invite him into her home. She was absolutely not ready to cross that intimate threshold, and she refused to grant him the immediate comfort of her hearth. But by opening the gate, she was acknowledging his right to exist within her general orbit, a silent confirmation that his agonizing penance had officially begun. "The storm has broken," Clara murmured, her voice carrying a quiet, profound resonance that seemed to actively mend the fractured, freezing air between them. "But the night is growing dangerously cold. You have surrendered your carriage, and you have abandoned your royal encampment. You will need to find shelter. Come, I will show you the boarding house near the market square." Kaelen nodded slowly, his wet silver hair falling over his deeply bruised eyes. A tiny, fragile spark of genuine, desperate hope ignited within the suffocating void of his chest. It was a minuscule, flickering flame, but it was enough to keep his failing heart beating for another night. "I will follow you, Clara," he rasped, his voice thick with raw, unrestrained emotion. "I will build a life in the shadows of your sanctuary. I will earn every single breath I take in your presence." Under the clearing, starlit sky, they took a quiet, tentative walk back toward the center of the village. Clara led the way, her crimson lunar shawl sweeping gracefully through the damp, freezing mist. Kaelen Valerius followed her, deliberately maintaining a respectful, measured distance. He walked exactly a half step behind her right shoulder, adopting the deeply ingrained, instinctual positioning of a loyal guardian fiercely protecting his queen. He did not attempt to close the physical gap. He did not reach out to touch the swaying hem of her dress. He simply focused on the rhythmic, squelching sound of their boots in the mud, entirely consumed by the profound, absolute gratitude of being allowed to walk in her wake. As they moved together through the quiet, shadow-draped streets of Brindlewood, the heavy, oppressive weight of the past year completely lifted from Clara's weary shoulders. The traumatic, deeply ingrained fear of being publicly discarded, ignored, and treated as a defective currency by the powerful elite had been entirely eradicated. She had reclaimed her profound, undeniable worth not through loud, aggressive demands, but through the terrifying power of her own silent resilience. The elite antagonist who had underestimated her value had been fundamentally, physically humbled, leaving zero room for his past arrogance. Beside her, Kaelen walked in absolute silence, a massive, vigilant shadow anchored completely to her quiet existence. The man who had once watched her laugh with another man from a place of toxic jealousy was now solely dedicated to protecting that beautiful, radiant laughter, even if he was never allowed to be the primary reason for it. The Alpha King who never begged had finally gotten down on his knees in the freezing rain, and in doing so, he had learned how to truly love. It was the ultimate poetic justice, a sovereign beast entirely gentled by a woman who had realized she was the true master of the storm.